An upbeat early take there on Cumbernauld, the Scottish new town built in response to the post-war housing crisis. It's one of the examples of innovative architecture and town planning that Douglas Murphy cites in his book Last Futures: Nature, Technology and the End of Architecture. But the intervening years have seen criticisms of many architecturally driven designs of towns and housing as hard to live in, or exacerbating problems that they were intended to solve. So where does that leave architects with new visions for how buildings ought to look and feel, and how has our view of their work changed too? Douglas is here, and so is Owen Hopkins, who's written Mavericks, Breaking the Mould of British Architecture, to accompany an exhibition and a series of talks at the Royal Academy in London, where he's curator of architecture. Douglas, you've been looking at the innovative approaches to architecture that came to the fore in the post-war era. Could these ideas about how the cities of the future were planned be seen as being rather quirky and of their time?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's...
You sound like you think that's a good thing.
Well, I think that's a discussion that's not often had, and it's extremely topical at the moment, what to do with the remnants of that period. But I think what's important to stress about that era is that it's a time when change was happening so fast, and governments and architects and planners and basically anyone involved in the built environment recognised that rapid change required ambition. And it's almost as though we live in a much more advanced time now with a much lower level of ambition about the cities we live in.
We might come back to that theme as we go along, but what do you think made this period so particularly fertile for new ideas?
It was partly the boom after the war, but it was partly the memory of the war as well. It was the housing crises that were left after World War II, the desperate need for people to be housed, but also the threat of the Soviet Union in the Western world, and the potential that, the public may go.
Just unpack that for me. Why would the threat of the Soviet Union have an impact on the kind of houses that were built, the built environment, and the ambition that you mentioned?
Well, a populace that wasn't housed properly and wasn't fed properly and didn't have jobs and so on would be more likely to revolt, basically. And so part of the post-war kind of consensus around architecture and city building was as part of a larger project to deal with and improve the lives of the majority of the populations.
And what kind of new ideas were being proposed? Perhaps you could explain the plug-in city to us.
Well, the plug-in city was basically an idea that came about from looking at trends in things like white goods, like fridges, trends in the motor industry, in rapid fabrication and so on, and applying these ideas to architecture, which at the time was still considered very backward compared to all these other industries and so on. And the idea was that in the future, if people were desperate to buy a new fridge every few years and change products, why wouldn't they be willing to change the house that they lived in and so on? So it was an extrapolation of that looked at what if your home was as disposable as everything else.
And to what extent were ideas like the plug-in city or adaptable megastructures ever implemented?
In isolated locations. I mean, Cumbernauld is the most infamous example, perhaps, of that kind of radical thinking. It was one of the earliest ones, and famously, not many people like it. But all across the world, there were many attempts, and you see it mostly in housing, I suppose. In
housing, but also in new universities built around.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Give us an example of that, if you could.
Well, a very good example is near Norwich. Is the University of East Anglia, which is a stunning campus designed by Dennis Lasdon in the early 1960s as part of the boom in new universities in the UK. And it features meandering raised walkways that flow through a forest and lead to these kind of strange Mayan ziggurats of housing pod units for the students to live in and so on, all completely tied in with the rolling East Anglian landscape.
Oh, and the architects Douglas is talking about there were flying in the face of orthodoxy at the time, and I think Douglas is suggesting perhaps that architects might do that a bit more now, or should do that a bit more. You've been looking at the mavericks of British architecture explicitly. Who are the key maverick figures for you in the second half of the 20th century?
Well, two of them appear in my book, and one of them is certainly very closely tied to the sort of thinking that Douglas has been exploring in his book, and that's Cedric Price, who in some ways is the sort of the archetypal maverick, the anti-architect in many ways, because he was very suspicious of mainstream architectural culture, and that the default response to a problem should automatically be a building. For him, it was almost a last resort at times. He, needed to say, built very little. And one of the buildings he did complete, the Interaction Centre in Kentish Town, which was in some ways the not quite realisation of his most famous idea, which was the Fun Palace, this new type of cultural facility that he had conceived with the theatre director Joan Littlewood. The Interaction Centre, it was demolished, and actually he was one of the people who said, well, you might as well demolish it. Its purpose has been served.
But what did it look like? It's a very basic question to ask of a maverick architect, but what would we have seen?
Well, it didn't look particularly like a building. The idea of the Fun Palace and in many ways of the Interaction Centre was to make use of technology, industrial components. So it looked like a series of factories brought together, porter cabins slotted in place. And the idea is, as Douglas was saying about the plug-in city, is that this was a structure that could evolve over time as the patterns of use changed, as technology improved, parts could be removed and upgraded. So it didn't look like a conventional building by any means.
And what about the legacy of the unbuilt architect? Does it matter? And Cedric Price, who I think you particularly advise you use, building was the last resort. So how does that then influence what comes afterwards?
Well, even though Price, for example, built very little, his ideas were very important, and we wouldn't have structures like the London Eye, like the Millennium Dome, and I think probably most pivotally the Pompidou Centre in Paris without his ideas. And I think architecture benefits more broadly from these sorts of figures who are deliberately going against the grain, who are defying convention, charting their own course, acting to provoke as much as anything else, to help move the whole discipline, the whole profession forward. And things which were maybe at some point in time very advanced, very speculative, in time become orthodoxy.
And are there contemporary mavericks, and who are they to your mind?
Well, there are two architects who appear in the book who are still practicing. The first is the practice, although they're now disbanded. The team have gone their separate directions. They're called FAT. That stands for Fashion Architecture Taste. And they arose in the mid-90s, rebelling really against the reaction to postmodernism's frivolities and ironies that had taken over mainstream architectural culture, which they felt had become a bit dull and a bit staid. And they wanted to shake things up by deliberately embracing popular culture and trying to really connect architecture with the masses. The other architect is Zaha Hadid, who is one of Britain's greatest architects, practicing now, has built all over the world. In the early part of her career, in the 1980s, she was very famous in architectural circles, but hadn't completed a building. Her designs for a long time were thought to be unbuildable, and it's only now that she's begun to build as technology's caught up.
But she's also giving this year's Reba Gold Medal lecture, which makes one wonder whether mavericks don't, in the end, end up being embraced by the establishment. But Douglas, there is a sense, isn't there, when we look back over the time that I think you're particularly interested in, that post-war housing crisis and the solutions to it, that architecture then was seen as being able to solve or help address social problems. Perhaps that's no longer the case, or some of the passion has gone out of that. What happened?
Well, a variety of things happened. The rapid growth of the overall rapid growth of the 60s didn't continue into the 70s. So various expectations of the near future and what people would be doing at that point were thwarted with the oil crisis and things like that. And then there were also social problems that it became politically convenient, as you may have seen in the news today and yesterday, that it became politically convenient to blame on architecture rather than more complex and difficult issues. And so by the late 70s and the 80s, the ideas of the post-war generation were...
Are you letting architects off the hook there? I mean, we talked about Cumberland earlier. I mean, there's an example. When you say it's politically convenient, I mean, that's a political viewpoint. Everyone's entitled to one of those, right? But it does seem if things go wrong, then architects build and they don't realise what they hoped that it would do in terms of social improvement. Surely a little bit of self-criticism might be in order.
Well, considering the whipping they've had for the last 30 years, I think it's about time there was a more nuanced look at things. I mean, one point would be that for every terrible sink estate, as Mr. Cameron would say, you have something like the Barbican, which is physically almost exactly the same, but is perfectly acceptable. And then...
But that's the point, isn't it? The context matters in architecture.
Well, absolutely. But then why would a design be criticised for a social problem? I mean, especially considering, architects don't pay for their own buildings. They're not the ones commissioning them. So the fact that they were designing these things in that era doesn't mean that the powers that be at the time didn't want it.
And do you think that we are getting an appetite back for the Maverick? I mean, you mentioned Zaha Hadid, who is now extremely well known, but was very much, seen as being rather out there. And then you also cited the Fat Collective. Do you think we have a sort of fascination, even if we're not entirely sure what we think these Mavericks should be delivering for us?
Yes, I think that's true. I don't know whether we're in a... I mean, this is actually going to be the subject of one of the debates that we're having around this, whether there is any future for Mavericks in architecture, because there are currently huge pressures to conform. If you have a next generation of architects who will be leaving 7 years of architecture school with tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt, there is pressure there to get a job and to, file in and do what's required, rather than being like perhaps someone from a previous generation who would decide to really do their own thing and chart their own course, break new ground. But I think there is always that fascination that people have with these sort of pioneer figures. And one would hope that there is always room for a charismatic architect to persuade their client or whoever is commissioning them to do something new and take a bit of a risk, because the results could be fantastic.